Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibra Maschil, Payaton, Oichlu Mashkim, and Ve'ejem Chulu. Let's begin by looking at what part of the Gemara Tosfos is coming to explain. So over here, we presented a brisa that supported the teaching of Rebbe. Rebbe said, "Akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz dami." That if a person did akir on his body, it amounts to akir on the item that was on him. So we brought a brisa that said, if an individual placed on himself items before Shabbos began, and then after Shabbos began, he walked out with them, the brisa ruled that he's chayev, and the reason is because akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz dami. Let's begin with a general outline of Tosfos. So the Gemara presented a brisa where we learned that akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz dami. There'll be two parts of Tosfos. Number one is Tosfos will explain that he's referring to a case where he stopped to rest after Shabbos began. That means he loaded on himself before Shabbos, then Shabbos began, then he stopped to rest, and after that he walked out into the Rosh Hashanah. Then he'll be chayav for Hitzon. The second point in Tosfos is that Tosfos will explain why the cases where he had the items on him before Shabbos began. Why does the brisa discuss a case where a person placed items on himself before Shabbos began? Let's see Tosfos in the flowchart. So we presented a brisa that said that if an individual placed items on himself before Shabbos began, and then after Shabbos began, he walked out into the Rosh Hashanah, he's chayiv. And from there we see akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz dami. Says Tosfos, it's referring to a case where he stopped to rest after Shabbos began before carrying it to another rishus. In other words, he placed it on himself before Shabbos. Shabbos begins, he stops to rest, and it has to be to rest, which is amad lafush, because otherwise it's not considered a real stop if he just stopped to adjust it. Why? Because otherwise he wouldn't be chayiv. If the individual never stopped to rest, he wouldn't be chayiv. Tosfos continues and explains, and even though we said akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz dami, so why wouldn't he be chayiv if he didn't stop to rest? He's walking around, did an akira. So he says it still wouldn't be chayiv, and the reason is because we would attribute the akira of that hitzah to the akira that was done before Shabbos. In other words, when he placed it on himself before Shabbos, that's the akira. If he never stopped to rest, that is the akira that relates to the later hitzah that happened on Shabbos into the Rosh Hashanah. And how do we know this? Tosfos brings a proof. We know this because it says later that if an individual is moving things from one corner of his house to another, so he was taking it from one corner to another, everything is mutter. Then at one point he lifted it up in items, taking it to another corner, and then changed his mind and decided, you know something, I'm going to take it outside. I have a better place for it. And he carries it out into the Rosh Hashanah and puts it down. The din is that he's putter. And the reason is because the original akira that he did was that he wanted to move it to another place in the Rosh Hashanah. And that akira was not an akira of an isser. Now, if we would say akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz dami applies even when a person didn't stop to rest, so then we would say when he lifted it up, he's walking towards the other corner with the intention of putting it there, and then he changed his mind and decided to walk outside. Now, as he starts to walk outside, we have a new akira. Clearly, we see that's not the case. That only when a person comes to a full rest will it be considered that what he does afterwards is a new akira. So that's the first point in Tosfos where he explains that it's referring to a case where he came to a complete rest before Shabbos began, in order that the first akira is done and over with, and now a new akira is taking place, and as a result, he now has the akira, the hitzah, and the anacha, and that's why he's chayiv. Now, the second point in Tosfos is that this is we chose a case where he placed the items on him before Shabbos. You could ask, why is the brisa talking about such a case? Why isn't it referred to a case where he placed the items on himself after Shabbos already began? Tosfos explains it's really related somewhat to the previous point, and that is that if the case was that he placed the items on himself after Shabbos already began, then we would have no proof of akiras gufei ka akiras chayvetz. We wouldn't know that the akira of the body amounts to the akira of the item, even if the person stopped to rest. Why not? Because let's take the case. The person lifted up the item, he placed it on himself after Shabbos already began. He's walking around, and then he stops to rest, and then he walks outside. If we would say he's chayev, it's possible that we would say the reason he's chayev is because originally when he picked up the item, that was his akira. That's the akira. He put on himself, that was the akira of the malacha. Then he's walking around, he stops to rest. All of that is irrelevant, because maybe akiras gufei is lavke akiras chayvetz dami. The akira of the body doesn't amount to the akira of the item. Same thing for the anacha. Then anachas gufei, lavke anachas chayvetz dami. The anacha of his body doesn't amount to the anacha of the item. So his walking around never affected the akira. It didn't create an anacha, didn't create a new akira, and therefore when he walks out later on and puts it down on Rosh Hashanah, he's chayev. It relates to the original akira when he picked it up to put it on his body, and therefore it's necessary to refer to a case where he picked it up and put it on his body before Shabbos. And then we clearly know if he's chayiv, it can't result from that akira, because that akira was done before Shabbos when it was mutter. It must be, it's because akira is gufay, akira is chayfetz dami. So to summarize, Tosfos makes 2 points about the brisa. Number one is that the brisa must be referring to a case where the individual stopped to rest after Shabbos began, because otherwise his akira at the beginning would be the akira related to this action, and he wouldn't be chayiv. And only because he stopped to rest does a new akira now take place, and as a result he's chayiv. So point number one was that it's referring to a case where he stopped to rest. And point number two in Tosfos was that the brisa needed to discuss a case where he originally put it on himself before Shabbos, and it couldn't be discussing a case where he placed it on himself on Shabbos, because then we wouldn't have any information regarding whether akira is gufay, akira is chayfetz dami, whether akira of a person's body amounts to the akira of the item that's on his body, or not, or do we say the akira of the body was an akira of the body, but there was no akira of the chayfetz done whatsoever.